Chapter 8, America Secedes from the Empire. Let's get started. I just want to say that periods 3 through 8 make up the bulk of the exam in May, and so we should really approach this section in this period with that kind of enthusiasm. Key concept 3.2 does specifically say the American Revolution's democratic and Republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government, and it references Thomas Paine and common sense, liberal ideas of republicanism, and the Declaration of Independence, so make sure you're familiar with those. In terms of Chapter 8, we get a good look at George Washington and his leadership, and the text does point out that he really did command respect, and that people believed in him, and so he's a very strong unifying force in the colonies. Sort of that ongoing theme of unity, early colonial unity, could be associated with him. We also see victory in the War for Independence against Great Britain, largely revolving around this French alliance. Certainly at the end of the second half of the American Revolution is largely due to French efforts and assistance. Keep in mind this was a minority movement from the onset. Maybe a third of Americans, colonists I should say, supported outright independence from Britain. But upon their independence, they did negotiate with Britain themselves. They were supposed to consult their French allies throughout this process, but they didn't do that. And we'll talk about why they may not have done that soon enough. Now, I'm sure you know by now that military conflict is really just one part of a war. So, much like our coverage of the French and Indian War, we'll focus more on the causes and effects than the fighting itself. Although I will cover what the American pageant says about the fighting of the American War for Independence in this video. Understand that unity at home throughout the fighting didn't really exist, and this war became globalized. It was the globalization of the war that created the possibility that the former British colonies could secure foreign assistance. Of course, we're talking about the French aid here. And finally, understand that the break from Britain and the new government that was created from that was a revolution of social and political order. So this This term disinterested is so important it actually gets its own slide. It was considered a virtue in 18th century political thinking, and in a nutshell, it means that you or one was able to act outside of their personal interest. This is a time where campaigning for public office was actually frowned upon. You were almost sort of thrust into the position by your peers, and we have to choose George Washington. He's the obvious choice to be in charge, not something he sought after. And in fact, as you probably know, when his second presidential term is eventually going to be finished, he actually returns home to tend to his fields. His very sort of noble way to go out. This idea of one being capable of being disinterested and politicians being virtuous is somewhat necessary in this idealistic type of Republican government that was championed by liberal 18th century political thinkers. So here's a picture of one right here on Thomas Jefferson, who really wanted this sort of republic of farmers. Sometimes we lose track of chronology. Now, I like timelines a lot to help keep that in order, but keep in mind that before the Declaration of Independence, we had about 14 months of fighting where Americans are emphatically trying to resolve the conflict with England, while at the same time they're fighting in the field. There's also this olive branch petition which professed the American loyalty to the king and begged to the king to stop future hostilities. The petition was rejected by the king, and with that rejection, the Americans were forced to choose to fight become independent or to submit to British rule and power. Some examples of the fighting throughout that time: May 1775, a small American force led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured the British garrisons at Ticonderoga and Crown Point. We also have in June of 1775 the Battle of Bunker Hill, obviously fought on Breed's Hill. The colonists actually were very successful initially in this, and were able to essentially mow down the British, who launched a frontal assault on them as they were hunkered down pretty good. Eventually, they ran out of gunpowder and had to flee. The British took the hill back, suffering heavy casualties. In July of 1775, the Second Continental Congress had released that olive branch petition that I had mentioned just a few minutes ago, which of course was rejected by King George III. In Chapter 7, we talked about principles that the colonists were upset with and willing to fight for. Here's another example of that. In August of 75, King George III proclaimed that the colonies were in rebellion, and while that's probably true by that point, what he did to add insult to injury, I suppose, was hire these German mercenaries, these Hessians. And so colonists would see this as sort of a family affair that now outsiders are being brought into, and that was not well liked by the colonists. The text did say that the Hessian troops were skilled and certainly good at what they were there to do, but perhaps some of them were more interested in booty than in duty. That's my favorite line in the whole book. Here are some numbers, and I don't really know how accurate these are, but it's a good time to point out that some of these Germans did stay in North America after the war. And so again, seeing demographic changes as a result, or throughout the 18th century, I guess is a better thing to say. Okay, in October of 75, the British burned what is now Portland, Maine. The colonists responded by attacking Canada. There was some desire to add it as a 14th colony, but also the goal might have been to remove it as a potential British base. This attack failed. We'll see interest in Canada coming back. The British also burned the town of Norfolk, Virginia in January of 1776. To the point before, though, it is kind of difficult to say you're fighting a defensive war if you're on the offensive. Enter the scene Thomas Paine, who released his pamphlet Common Sense in, I think, January of 1776, so just a few months now before the Declaration of Independence. He argued that the colonies had outgrown any need for English domination and that they should be given independence. He's taking ideas of the Enlightenment and popularizing them. He's writing them in a language that was something the common man could identify with, and it also had a bit of energy, vigor to it as well. What is he saying? Part of what he's saying here is that this system of mercantilism, well, it was restrictive to the colonies, who could do better if they were not a part of this British Empire any longer. And here he is, one of the most widely read pamphlets ever. These enlightened ideas that Paine is discussing in his Common Sense are liberal ideas about republicanism. And he's calling for the creation of a new kind of political society, specifically a republic, where power flowed from the people themselves. This is sort of like that social contract kind of idea of government by consent. Now, these traditions existed in the colonies, especially New England, and you may see here, such as the Chester Town Hall, citizens, residents of the town coming together and actively participating in government, having a say. And again, getting back to these ideas of taxation without representation, just adding fuel to this fire. Now, radicals placed a lot of faith in the common people, and these are radical Republicans, not to be confused with the later radical Republicans of the 19th century, but these are more radical Republicans of the 18th century. They sort of believe that everybody could be virtuous and everybody could be disinterested and act for the good of all. There were some, however, that felt that that was too democratic. In fact, that was dangerous. And instead, there should be a natural aristocracy of talent, not one that was entitled through birth, but one that sort of naturally rose to the forefront. They feared the lower orders of society, and they feared a radical leveling of the social order. So they still preferred a hierarchy of sorts, but it was one based on this natural rise. I realize there's a lot on this slide, and I apologize for that, but there's quite a lot to say. First of all, on July 2nd, a resolution put forth by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was passed, and it stated that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Again, calling upon sort of natural rights as well as common sense. The idea that an island should not rule a continent is something that Paine discussed for sure back in January. At that time, actually before then, Thomas Jefferson was appointed to draft up a Declaration of Independence, which really was sort of a statement or explanation as to why the colonists should be free. There's a list of grievances included in that declaration, and we'll take a look at this in class. It actually was approved, obviously, on July 4th, 1776, although I think the pageant said that Ben Franklin predicted that July 2nd would be celebrated as Independence Day with fireworks for years to come. Here's that declaration, of course, and you can kind of see the preamble there. We'll talk about that some more in class. And here's another picture of Jefferson, who was very young, relatively speaking, at the time that he wrote this, but was recognized for his skill in writing. And here is Richard Henry Lee, who is the the grandfather of this Lee, Robert E. Lee. The Lees were a very prominent family in Virginia, and I believe still may be today, part of those first families of Virginia. Sort of an iconic image depicting the presentation of the Declaration, right, by the committee, with Jefferson there in the center. Again, complaining that natural rights were being ignored or violated by King George III, and that somewhat justifies the split from Britain. The passage of the Declaration didn't really guarantee independence, but it did force people to choose sides. And should you choose to join the Patriot cause, well, you're now in open rebellion against Great Britain. In addition to that, declaring independence made foreign aid possible, and when France chose to provide that foreign aid, they are recognizing the independence and legitimizing the independence of the colonies. A little comparison of who might be likely to join the Patriot cause and who might be likely to join the Loyalist cause. And as you might assume, it was younger people who were very idealistic who were likely to join the Patriot cause. People who didn't have as much money, people who maybe were sort of on the frontier region. These younger people often were joining the militia, and they were very good at educating people about the necessity of the cause. The pageant mentioned that the British could come into a town and they could occupy the town, but once they left, the militia would very quickly take up the sort of re-education phase and reminding people about all of the trespassing on their natural rights of King George III in Great Britain. A lot of times, Congregationalists and Presbyterians were likely to be patriots. As I said before, New England was a hotbed for the Patriot cause. That makes sense. They're the New England Patriots, right? Loyalists, on the other hand, believe that their loyalty will lead to their being rewarded by King George III after he, of course, won the war. I mean, who's going to root against the British in this? They were often located in the South, in the cities. They were of established generations and families. They were likely to be Anglicans, except for Virginia. And after the war, when the British do lose, 80,000 Loyalists leave, and their property was confiscated, despite the fact that Congress recommended that did not happen. Here's a Patriot definition of a Tory: a thing whose head is in England and his body in America, and his neck ought to be stretched. The harassment of Loyalists increased after the Declaration of Independence. They were subjected to more ridicule, hangings, and imprisonment, and as a result of that, many of them fled to the British lines. Before we talk about specific battles, let's look at just Washington's army in general. In a nutshell, he was largely outnumbered, didn't really have much of a navy at all. The troops that he had were few, they were poorly trained, poorly equipped. After March of 1776, when the British evacuated Boston, the British will concentrate their forces in New York City. August of 76, Washington and his men were overpowered by the British at the Battle of Long Island, and he then escapes to Manhattan Island. In December 26, day after Christmas here, Washington crossed the Delaware to surprise and capture 1,000 Hessians at Trenton as they slept off the effects of their Christmas dinner, it said. Just to sort of build on the last slide, if Britain had destroyed Washington's army at Long Island, then the revolution could have been over right there. As it was, as he retreated across New Jersey in November, December of 1776, many people just deserted. Enlistments for the regular army would end December 31st, and the Continental Army almost fell apart. Now, Washington knew that he needed a victory before those enlistments were up, and so he decided to attack the Hessians at Trenton. That victory certainly boosted morale, as did the victory in the Battle of Princeton, which forced Britain to retreat from New Jersey. These victories increased enlistments and morale, and the text suggests the revolution was saved. And then we have Valley Forge, and this is a symbol for the suffering that the colonists endured during the Revolution. The Continental Army had spent the winter quarters at Valley Forge. Many men died of disease and hunger or froze to death. At this time, Baron von Steuben was brought to camp to train and drill these American soldiers into a professional army for the first time. And while there, Washington heard of the victory at Saratoga, which of course will be a major turning point as it encouraged the French to provide aid to the colonists and their rebellion. As I said before, New England was a hotbed for revolutionary zeal, and the British recognized that, and they hoped to sever New England from the rest of the states to possibly paralyze the American cause. They sent General Burgoyne down the Lake Champlain route from Canada, where he would hopefully be reinforced by General Howe near Albany. Unfortunately, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire command at Saratoga on October 17, 1777, to the American General Horatio Gates. Unfortunately for Burgoyne, that is, not for the colonists. And here you can see his route ending at Saratoga. Battle of Saratoga was very important for the war effort. It immensely revived the faltering colonial cause. We just said that there were soldiers freezing to death at Valley Forge, and it made possible the aid from France. It was a decisive victory that proved the capability of the American military. Don't forget Saratoga, that is. So the Continental Congress initially recommended an economic connection with France, not a political or military connection, and they sent Ben Franklin to Paris to negotiate a treaty. He was dressed very simply, and he was revered by Parisians. Here you can see him in his homespun clothing with his plain gray hair hanging out of his fur cap. He was the American enlightened thinker. He was the scientist, and they loved him in France. There's going to be two offers on the table. First of all, the English offered home rule within the realm of the empire after their loss at Saratoga, and the French, just after this, will actually offer a military alliance, and they will formally recognize the independent states. And of course, that's the route that the colonists take. Remember, globalization is a major part of the push curriculum here. Spain and Holland became allied against Britain in 1779 as well, and Catherine the Great of Russia led the creation of armed neutrality, which essentially put the remaining neutral nations of Europe against Britain, although passively such. The British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate their strength in New York City. 1780, the British acquired General Benedict Arnold, who traded sides and turned against the American cause. He had planned on giving the British access to West Point, but that did not work out for him. Also not working out for the British would be Nathaniel Greene kicking all of the British troops out of Georgia and South Carolina. Arnold did have some success, though. Here is a plaque at Fort Griswold in Groton, Connecticut, commemorating the Battle of Groton Heights. Arnold was there. Apparently, he grew up in Norwich, Connecticut, which is just up the river from Groton, but he did win this battle, and he also burned New London. 1784, the United States signed their first treaty with an Indian nation. It was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, and it was signed with the Iroquois. And John Paul Jones was known as the father of the American Navy, and while it was quite small, certainly held its own as best it could against the most powerful navy in the world. John Paul Jones was also a privateer, or a legalized pirate. The final major battle in the War for Independence will be fought at Yorktown, where British General Cornwallis had fallen back to in the Chesapeake Bay. The French Admiral de Grasse had offered to join the Americans in an assault of Cornwallis from the sea, and George Washington, along with French General Rochambeau's army, would attack from land. Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. Here you can see the British and how they're pretty much trapped between the French Navy, the French Army, and the American Continental Army as well. And here, of course, an iconic image of that Yorktown battle. A new Treaty of Paris in 1783 will be signed. This time, Ben Franklin will go alongside John Adams of New England and John Jay of New York to negotiate this. These men were supposed to consult their French allies at all stages of the negotiation. They did not do this, however. They wanted Congress to be in charge. They didn't want this treaty to be dictated by France. I think that's a good move by the United States moving forward. In terms of the terms of the treaty, Britain recognized American independence and also granted generous boundaries, which I'll show you a map in just a second. Congress also was supposed to recommend that Loyalist property be returned and that Loyalists would not be harassed. Much of the Loyalist property was actually confiscated, as I said earlier. In addition to that, the states and the United States had to agree not to pass any laws that would become barriers or obstacles to paying off debt that was owed to Britain. Take a look at the map. You can see all of the green now representing this new nation of the United States. And the first thing that the U.S. will need to do is probably figure out what to do with the old Northwest Territory. And that happens under the Articles of Confederation, something we'll talk about in Chapter 9. I'm not sure losing a war is ever a good thing, but the Treaty of Paris, as it was signed between Britain and the United States now, is going to be a way to break up some of this growing relationship between France and the new United States of America. It also gave England a chance to rebuild its army and navy before future conflicts might pop up. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed Chapter 8. We'll see you in class real soon. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below or just send me an email. Take care.